"Son, tomorrow we'll have to sleep on the floor." Those 9 words hit me like a physical blow, sucking the air from my lungs and making the walls of our tiny apartment feel like they were closing in. I was 18 years old, 3 weeks away from high school graduation, with acceptance letters to 2 state universities sitting on my desk. But none of that mattered now, because my mother, the strongest woman I'd ever known, was standing in our living room with tears in her eyes, telling me that we had finally hit bottom. The eviction notice crumpled in her shaking hands was dated today. We had 48 hours to vacate the premises or face forcible removal by the sheriff's department. After 8 months of fighting, scheming, begging, and praying, we were out of options, out of money, and apparently out of luck. I looked around our small living room, the secondhand couch where I'd spent countless hours doing homework, the coffee table my mom had found at a yard sale and painted bright yellow because every home needs sunshine, the bookshelf packed with novels and textbooks that represented my ticket to a different kind of life. By Thursday morning, all of it would be on the sidewalk, and we would be sleeping on the hardwood floor of whoever was kind enough to take us in. But as I watched my mother collapse onto that yellow coffee table, her shoulders shaking with the kind of sobs that come from deep in your soul, I made a decision that would change both of our lives forever. I wasn't going to let her spend another night on anyone's floor. Not my mother, who had worked 3 jobs to keep us housed. Not my mother, who had walked to work in the rain so I could have bus money for school. Not my mother, who had sacrificed everything so I could have a chance at something better. That night, lying on that cold hardwood floor one last time, I made a promise that would either save us or destroy me. I was going to find a way to make enough money in 72 hours to not only prevent our eviction, but to move us somewhere better. Somewhere worthy of the woman who had given me everything. I just had no idea what that promise would cost me. My name is Deshaun Williams, and I grew up understanding that poverty wasn't just about not having money. It was about living in constant fear that what little you had could disappear without warning. Every month was a juggling act of rent versus groceries, utilities versus transportation, hope versus reality. My mother, Angela, was a master of making something from nothing, turning government assistance into birthday parties, food stamps into family dinners that felt like celebrations. She worked as a certified nursing assistant at a local hospital, pulling 12-hour shifts that left her exhausted but never broken. When that wasn't enough, she cleaned offices at night. When that still wasn't enough, she took in sewing from neighbors who needed alterations. I never heard her complain, never saw her feel sorry for herself, never watched her blame anyone else for our circumstances. What I did see was a woman who believed that education was the only ladder out of the hole we'd been born into. Every report card was celebrated like a victory. Every academic achievement was proof that her sacrifices meant something. When I scored high enough on the SAT to qualify for state university admission, she cried tears of joy and worked overtime for 3 weeks to pay for the application fees. "Baby," she used to say while helping me with homework at that yellow coffee table, "your brain is your ticket to somewhere I could never go. Don't you dare waste it." I was valedictorian of my high school class, captain of the debate team, and had been accepted to study computer science at Georgia State University with partial scholarship coverage. I was going to be the first person in my family to graduate from college, the first to work in an air-conditioned office, the first to earn enough money that rent wasn't a monthly crisis. But dreams don't pay for groceries, and potential doesn't cover medical bills. When my mother fell at work 6 months before my graduation, injuring her back badly enough to require surgery and 3 months of recovery time, our carefully balanced financial house of cards collapsed completely. The disability payments were a fraction of her regular salary. The medical bills were astronomical, even with insurance. The landlord, who had been patient during previous difficult months, finally ran out of sympathy. And I watched the strongest person I knew slowly crumble under the weight of circumstances beyond her control. The worst part wasn't the financial stress. It was watching my mother blame herself for what was happening to us. She would sit at that coffee table with a calculator and a stack of bills, trying to make impossible math work out, apologizing to me over and over for ruining my future. "I'm sorry, baby," she would whisper. "I'm so sorry I couldn't do better for you." But she had done better for me. She had raised me to believe that intelligence and hard work could overcome any obstacle. She had taught me to see temporary setbacks as challenges to solve rather than permanent defeats to accept. She had shown me what real strength looked like, even when she didn't feel strong herself. Now it was my turn to show her what her son was made of. Have you ever slept on the floor not by choice, but because there was nowhere else to go? When you realized that your family's love couldn't pay the rent? That your mother's sacrifices couldn't protect you from a system designed to keep people like you permanently unstable? When you understood that no matter how hard you try to do everything right, sometimes the math just doesn't work out in your favor? That's where I was at 18, lying on that hardwood floor, listening to my mother cry, softly in the next room, because she thought she had failed me. But failure wasn't sleeping on the floor. Failure would have been accepting that this was as good as our lives were going to get. The path that led us to that eviction notice had been paved with small defeats that accumulated into catastrophe. It started with Mom's injury at work, a slip on a wet hospital floor that compressed 3 vertebrae and left her unable to lift patients or work her regular shifts. Workers' compensation covered some of the medical expenses, but the bureaucratic maze of forms and approvals meant months of delayed payments and denied claims. While she was recovering, I took on a part-time job at a local grocery store, stocking shelves and bagging groceries for minimum wage. Between school and work, I was pulling 16-hour days, but teenage wages couldn't replace adult income. We fell behind on rent first, then utilities, then car payments. Each month, the gap between what we owed and what we could pay grew wider. Our landlord, Mr. Peterson, was a middle-aged white man who owned 6 rental properties in our predominantly black neighborhood. For the first few months of missed payments, he was understanding. He accepted partial rent, agreed to payment plans, even waived some late fees. But understanding has limits, especially when those limits are determined by mortgage payments and profit margins. "I'm running a business, not a charity," he finally told my mother during what would be our last face-to-face conversation with him. "I've been more than fair, but I can't carry you indefinitely." Fair. As if fairness had anything to do with a woman getting injured at work and losing income through no fault of her own. As if fairness explained why medical bankruptcy was the leading cause of homelessness in the richest country in human history. As if fairness had been involved in any part of the system that had brought us to this point. But Peterson wasn't evil. He was just another cog in a machine designed to extract maximum profit from human desperation. Behind him were banks that demanded mortgage payments, insurance companies that found creative ways to deny claims, and a society that had decided that housing was a commodity to be bought and sold rather than a human right to be protected. The eviction notice wasn't just paper. It was proof that trying wasn't enough, that good intentions couldn't overcome bad systems, that individual excellence meant nothing in the face of institutional indifference. After Peterson left that day, my mother sat at the yellow coffee table and cried harder than I had ever seen her cry. Not the quiet tears of frustration that I'd witnessed during previous difficult months, but the deep, wrenching sobs of someone whose spirit was finally breaking. "I failed you," she whispered between gasps. "I promised you better than this, and I failed." I knelt beside her chair and took her hands in mine. "Mom, you didn't fail me. The system failed us." "No, baby. A good mother would have found a way. A good mother would have had savings, would have been prepared, would have protected her child from this." That's when I realized that my mother's greatest fear wasn't homelessness. It was the belief that she had somehow let me down, that her love wasn't enough to shield me from the harsh realities of American poverty. She had internalized the myth that individual effort alone determines outcomes, that people who struggle must somehow deserve their struggles. But I knew better because she had taught me better. She had shown me through 18 years of sacrifice and determination that some battles are too big for any one person to fight alone. She had demonstrated that systemic problems require systemic solutions, even when those solutions seem impossible to achieve. That's when I knew I couldn't be her son anymore. I had to be her savior. Not because she had failed, but because she had succeeded in raising someone who refused to accept defeat as permanent. The next morning, I woke up with 47 hours until eviction and a plan that was equal parts desperate and dangerous. I had researched every legitimate opportunity for fast money, contests, day labor, selling possessions, but the math was simple and brutal. Even if I worked 24 hours straight for the next 2 days, I couldn't earn enough at minimum wage to cover what we owed. I needed to make $3,000 in less than 48 hours. That meant thinking beyond legal minimum wage jobs and into territory I had never considered before. I started with online searches for how to make money fast, scrolling through hundreds of articles promising easy wealth through cryptocurrency trading, multi-level marketing schemes, and various forms of digital entrepreneurship. Most were obvious scams, but some seemed legitimate enough to investigate further. That's how I discovered Marcus Thompson. Marcus was a 25-year-old who claimed to have made $50,000 in 6 months through alternative investment strategies and was willing to teach others his methods for a small, upfront fee. His social media profiles showed expensive cars, designer clothes, and wads of cash that seemed to prove his success was real. His next seminar was scheduled for that evening at a hotel conference room downtown. Admission was $200. Money we couldn't afford to lose, but also money that might be our only shot at salvation. I convinced my mother to let me use her credit card, promising I would pay her back as soon as the seminar paid off. She was skeptical, but desperation makes people consider options they would normally dismiss. The conference room was packed with people who looked exactly like us: working-class families facing financial crises, young adults trying to escape minimum wage jobs, middle-aged people who had been laid off and were running out of options. Everyone was dressed in their best clothes, trying to look successful while desperately seeking the secrets of actual success. Marcus took the stage wearing a perfectly tailored suit and a smile that seemed designed to inspire confidence. He spoke about disrupting traditional financial systems and leveraging market inefficiencies and building multiple income streams through strategic partnerships. It all sounded sophisticated and legitimate, right up until he explained what his alternative investment strategy actually involved. Drug running. Not hard drugs, he assured us, just marijuana transportation between states where laws varied. Low risk, high reward, completely manageable for people who were careful and smart about it. I had 72 hours to make more money than my mother made in 6 months, and this man was telling me exactly how to do it. The room was completely silent as Marcus explained the logistics. Simple transportation jobs that paid between $1,000 and $5,000, depending on the distance and quantity involved. No violence, no selling to kids, just moving product from places where it was legal to places where people were willing to pay premium prices. "I'm not going to lie to you," Marcus said, scanning the faces of his desperate audience. "There's risk involved, but there's risk in everything. Risk in staying poor, risk in losing your home, risk in watching your family suffer while you follow rules written by people who never had to choose between rent and groceries." He handed out business cards with just a phone number printed on them. "If you're interested in changing your life, call this number tomorrow. If you're satisfied with struggling, throw the card away and go home." I slipped the card into my wallet and tried to convince myself I was just keeping my options open. The drive home was the longest 20 minutes of my life. My mother asked how the seminar went, and I told her it was informative and gave me some ideas to think about. Both statements were technically true, even though they didn't capture the moral earthquake happening inside my head. I had always been the good kid, honor roll student, debate team captain, the one who followed rules and believed that hard work and education would eventually pay off. I had never stolen anything, never cheated on a test, never even gotten a detention. My mother had raised me to believe that character was more important than money, that integrity was something no one could take away from you. But character doesn't pay rent. Integrity doesn't prevent eviction. And as I sat in our apartment that night, surrounded by boxes we couldn't afford to pack professionally and furniture we might have to abandon, I started to understand how good people end up making bad choices. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror and tried to see what Marcus had seen. Someone desperate enough to consider options I had never thought possible. Someone whose moral boundaries had become flexible under the pressure of circumstance. The person staring back at me looked tired, scared, and far older than 18. He looked like someone who was running out of time and running out of choices. He looked like someone who might be willing to risk everything on the chance of saving his family. I didn't call the number that night, but I didn't throw the card away either. The next morning brought 36 hours until eviction and a phone call that made my decision for me. My mother's disability claim had been denied on a technicality, some paperwork that hadn't been filed correctly by the hospital's Human Resources Department. The appeals process would take months, and we had hours. She hung up the phone and looked at me with the kind of exhaustion that goes deeper than physical tiredness. I'm sorry, baby. I'm so sorry. That's when I went into my bedroom, closed the door, and dialed the number on Marcus's card. The voice that answered was crisp and professional. You attended last night's presentation? Yes. Are you interested in an opportunity? I thought about my mother crying in the living room, about sleeping on floors, about watching 18 years of dreams disappear because we couldn't come up with $3,000. Yes. There's a job leaving tonight. Simple run to Jacksonville and back. $5,000 payout, enough to cover your immediate expenses and then some. You interested? $5,000. Enough to stop the eviction, catch up on utilities, maybe even put some aside for emergencies. All for one night's work. What do I need to do? The man's smile was audible through the phone. Meet me at the address I'm going to give you at 8 p.m. tonight. Bring your driver's license and come alone. The warehouse was in an industrial district I had never visited, surrounded by legitimate businesses that were closed for the evening. My hands were shaking as I parked and walked to the entrance where Marcus was waiting with two other men I didn't recognize. You sure about this? Marcus asked, studying my face in the dim light from a street lamp. I thought about my mother, about the eviction notice, about 18 years of watching her sacrifice everything for my future. I'm sure. That's when Marcus handed me a gym bag and a set of car keys. The car is parked around back. GPS coordinates for the delivery location are programmed into the system. You drive there, hand over the bag, collect payment, and drive back. Simple as that. What's in the bag? Marcus looked at me like I had asked a stupid question. Nothing you need to worry about. The less you know, the safer you are. I took the keys and the bag, which was heavier than I had expected. Inside the car, a nondescript Honda with Georgia plates, I found an envelope with $500 in cash and a note. Gas money and dinner. See you in the morning. The drive to Jacksonville should have taken 4 hours, but it felt like the longest night of my life. Every police car I passed made my heart race. Every traffic light felt like a potential trap. Every mile took me further from the person I thought I was, and closer to someone I wasn't sure I wanted to become. But it also took me closer to $5,000 and the chance to save my family. The delivery location was a 24-hour truck stop outside Jacksonville, exactly the kind of anonymous place where people conduct business they don't want noticed. I was supposed to meet someone named Carlos who would be wearing a Florida State baseball cap and drinking coffee at the counter. Carlos was exactly where he was supposed to be, looking completely ordinary except for his eyes, which were the kind of alert that comes from years of watching for danger. He took the bag without comment, handed me an envelope full of cash, and walked away like nothing had happened. That was it. 5 minutes of interaction that netted me more money than I had ever seen in my life. The drive home was different, triumphant instead of terrified. I had done something I never thought I would do, but I had done it successfully. No violence, no victims, just a simple transaction between consenting adults in a system that criminalized choices that harmed no one. I was going to save my mother's house. I was going to prevent our eviction. I was going to be the hero of my own family's story. But when I pulled into our apartment complex at 6 a.m., there were police cars in the parking lot. Sitting in that police station, handcuffed to a metal chair while detectives asked questions I couldn't answer without incriminating myself further, I realized I had become exactly what the system expected me to become. A young black man who had chosen crime over patience, quick money over slow progress, easy solutions over hard work. The arrest had been a setup from the beginning. Marcus Thompson wasn't a successful entrepreneur teaching alternative investment strategies. He was an informant working with law enforcement to catch desperate people doing exactly what I had done. The whole seminar had been designed to identify potential defendants, and I had walked right into the trap. You seem like a smart kid, the detective said, sitting across from me with a file full of photos showing me accepting the bag, loading it into the car, and making the delivery. Full scholarship to Georgia State, honor roll student, no prior criminal record. What made you think this was a good idea? How could I explain that good ideas are luxuries you can afford when your family isn't facing homelessness? How could I make him understand that intelligence means nothing when the system is designed to keep intelligent people from accessing legitimate opportunities? Instead, I just said, "My mother needed me to save her." The detective nodded like he had heard similar stories before. And how did that work out? I was facing felony drug trafficking charges that carried a mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years in federal prison. My college acceptance would be revoked. My mother would not only lose our apartment, but would have to deal with the shame and stigma of having a son in prison. I had tried to save her and had instead destroyed both of our futures with a single night of bad judgment. But sometimes rock bottom becomes the foundation for everything you build afterward. The person who changed my life was sitting in the cell next to mine, a 40-year-old woman named Patricia Washington, who was facing similar charges for similar reasons. She had been caught transporting drugs to pay for her daughter's cancer treatment, and this was her third offense, which meant she was looking at decades in prison. "You know what the difference is between you and me?" she asked during the long night we spent waiting for our bail hearings. "What?" "This is your first time getting caught. That means you still have options I don't have." Patricia had grown up in the same kind of neighborhood I had, raised by a single mother who worked multiple jobs to make ends meet. But instead of focusing on education, she had gotten pregnant at 16, dropped out of school, and spent the next 20 years cycling through minimum wage jobs that never paid enough to build anything lasting. "I kept telling myself I was just going to do it once," she explained. "Just one job to catch up on rent. Just one more to pay for daycare. Just one more to cover my daughter's medication. But easy money is never easy, and quick fixes always cost more than you think you're paying." She looked at me through the bars that separated our cells. "But you're different. You've got education, you've got opportunities, you've got a chance to learn from this instead of being destroyed by it. I've got felony charges that are going to follow me forever. You've got first offense status and a public defender who might actually care about keeping a kid like you out of prison. More importantly, you've got a brain that can figure out how to build something legitimate instead of always looking for shortcuts." That's when she told me about her sister Michelle, who ran a nonprofit organization that helped people transitioning out of difficult circumstances. Job training, financial literacy, legal advocacy, community support, all the resources that people like us needed but never knew how to access. "Michelle's been where we are," Patricia said. "She made some bad choices, paid the price, and then spent the next 15 years building something that helps other people avoid the same mistakes." She looked at me and saw something I had forgotten existed: potential. The next morning, my public defender worked out a plea agreement that kept me out of prison in exchange for 6 months of community service and mandatory participation in a drug court program. It was a gift I didn't deserve, but one I was determined not to waste. Michelle Washington's nonprofit was located in a converted warehouse in the same industrial district where I had made my terrible decision. But where that night had been about quick money and easy solutions, this place was about slow progress and sustainable change. Michelle was a tall, elegant woman in her 40s who carried herself with the confidence that comes from having survived things that would have broken other people. She listened to my story without judgment, asked pointed questions about my goals and my skills, and then offered me something I hadn't expected: a legitimate way to make the kind of money I needed to help my family. "We need someone to help other young people navigate the college financial aid system," she said. "Someone who understands what it's like to be smart and poor and desperate. Someone who made mistakes but learned from them instead of being defined by them." The job paid $15 an hour, triple what I had been making at the grocery store. More importantly, it came with training in grant writing, nonprofit management, and community organizing. Skills that could translate into a real career helping people solve problems through systems instead of around them. But the most valuable thing Michelle gave me wasn't a job. It was a different way of understanding what had happened to my family and what I could do about it. "The system that almost destroyed you and your mother isn't broken," she explained during my first week of training. "It's working exactly as designed, to keep people like us desperate enough to make bad choices that justify treating us like criminals instead of citizens who deserve support." She showed me statistics about housing inequality, medical bankruptcy, and the school-to-prison pipeline. She explained how predatory lending, discriminatory hiring practices, and systematic underinvestment in communities like ours created the conditions that made crime seem like a rational choice. But she also showed me examples of people who had figured out how to navigate legitimate systems to create lasting change. People who had turned their anger and desperation into advocacy and action. People who had learned to fight the system by understanding it well enough to beat it at its own game. "Revenge isn't about getting back at individual people," Michelle said. It's about succeeding so thoroughly that you prove the system wrong about what people like us are capable of achieving. For the first time in months, hope felt like something I could actually touch. The work was harder than anything I had ever done, but it was the kind of hard that built something instead of just surviving something. I spent my days helping teenage parents complete FAFSA applications, teaching adults with criminal records how to write resumes that emphasize skills over mistakes, and connecting families facing eviction with legal resources they never knew existed. Every person I helped felt like partial redemption for the night I had made the worst decision of my life. Every family that avoided eviction was proof that there were legitimate solutions to problems that seemed to require desperate measures. But the most satisfying part of the work was discovering that my criminal record, which I had thought would be a permanent barrier to success, actually made me better at helping other people in similar situations. I understood their desperation because I had been desperate. I knew why they were considering illegal options because I had considered them too. And I could speak to them with credibility about legitimate alternatives because I had learned the hard way that shortcuts only lead to deeper problems. 6 months after that night in Jacksonville, I had completed my community service, graduated from drug court, and earned enough money to move my mother and myself into a small but decent apartment in a better neighborhood. More importantly, I had discovered something about myself that I never would have found if I hadn't hit rock bottom first. I was good at helping people solve impossible problems through legitimate means. I was good at navigating bureaucratic systems that seemed designed to exclude people like us. And I was good at building trust with people who had been let down by every institution they had ever encountered. Michelle offered me a full-time position with her organization, with the opportunity to earn my bachelor's degree through a partnership with a local university that provided tuition assistance for nonprofit employees. It wasn't the computer science degree I had originally planned, but it was something better. Education that was directly connected to work that mattered. My mother cried when I told her about the job offer, but this time they were tears of pride instead of desperation. "I knew you would figure it out," she said, holding me in the kitchen of our new apartment. "I never doubted that you would find a way." But I had doubted it. During that long night in jail, during the months of uncertainty about whether I would go to prison, during the countless times I replayed that terrible decision and wished I could take it back. What I learned was that rock bottom isn't the end of your story. It's the foundation for everything you build afterward. The shame, the fear, the desperate choices that almost destroyed my future had also taught me things about resilience and resourcefulness that no classroom could have provided. What would you do if your family's survival depended on you becoming someone you swore you'd never be? When does desperation justify compromise, and when does compromise become corruption? How do you maintain your integrity when the system seems designed to reward people who abandon theirs? These weren't abstract questions anymore. They were the realities I had lived through, the choices I had made, and the lessons I carried forward into a different kind of life. 2 years later, I was completing my bachelor's degree in social work while managing a program that helped young adults aging out of foster care access higher education. The work was challenging, meaningful, and well paid enough that my mother had been able to reduce her hours at the hospital and focus on her own recovery. We lived in a small house now, nothing fancy, but clean and safe and ours. The hardwood floors were covered with rugs that my mother had chosen herself. There was furniture in every room, books on the shelves, and pictures on the walls that showed a family that had survived something difficult and come out stronger. But the most important change wasn't in our living situation. It was in how we understood our place in the world. We weren't victims of circumstances beyond our control. We weren't criminals who had gotten lucky with lenient treatment. We were people who had learned to work within legitimate systems to create the kind of stability that we had once thought was impossible. The night before my college graduation, my mother and I sat in our living room, on furniture instead of floors, talking about how different our lives had become since that terrible evening when she had told me we would have to sleep on the floor. "Do you ever regret the choice you made?" she asked. "Taking that job with Marcus, getting arrested, going through all that trouble?" I thought about it for a moment, remembering the fear and shame of that night, but also remembering how it had led to everything good that had happened afterward. "I regret that it took something that dramatic to teach me what I needed to learn," I said, "but I don't regret learning it. The truth was that my arrest had saved me from a much worse fate. the slow degradation that comes from always looking for shortcuts, always believing that the system couldn't be beaten through legitimate means, always choosing immediate relief over long-term solutions. If I hadn't been caught that night, I probably would have continued making similar choices, each one a little easier to justify, each one taking me further from the person my mother had raised me to be. Eventually, I would have become someone who saw crime as a career instead of a desperate mistake. Instead, I had learned that the system could be beaten, but only by people who understood it well enough to navigate it legitimately. I had discovered that there were resources and opportunities available to families like ours, but they required knowledge, persistence, and the kind of social connections that schools don't teach, and communities like ours often don't provide. Most importantly, I had learned the difference between surviving and thriving, between temporary solutions and permanent change, between being a victim of circumstances and being an architect of your own destiny. The day of my graduation, I walked across the stage to receive my Bachelor of Social Work degree with my mother sitting in the front row, tears streaming down her face. But these weren't tears of desperation or fear. They were tears of pride, accomplishment, and vindication. Her son, who had once been handcuffed in a police station, was now graduating summa cum laude from the same university that had almost rescinded his acceptance. After the ceremony, we drove to the old apartment complex where we used to live, the place where I had heard those 9 words that changed everything. The building looked smaller than I remembered, more run down, filled with the same kinds of families we had once been, working hard, struggling to make ends meet, one crisis away from catastrophe. "You know what the difference is between them and us now?" my mother asked, watching children play in the courtyard while their parents sat on stoops, probably discussing the same kinds of money problems we used to face. "What?" "We learned how the system actually works instead of just complaining that it was broken." She was right. The difference wasn't that we had gotten lucky or that we were somehow more deserving than other struggling families. The difference was that we had been forced to learn skills and access resources that should have been available to everyone but weren't widely known or easily accessible. Financial literacy, grant writing, nonprofit management, legal advocacy, community organizing. These weren't advanced skills that required years of specialized education. They were practical tools that could help any family navigate the systems that determined whether they thrived or merely survived. That's when I realized what my real calling was going to be. 3 months after graduation, I founded the Second Chance Educational Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to teaching practical life skills to young adults who had made mistakes but wanted to build legitimate futures. The mission was simple: help people learn from their bad decisions instead of being permanently defined by them. Our first office was a single room in the same community center where Michelle Washington had first offered me hope. We started with a budget of $3,000, ironically the same amount I had once been desperate enough to risk my freedom to obtain, and a phone number that connected to my personal cell phone. But within 6 months, we had helped 47 young adults complete their GEDs, 12 people start small businesses with microloans, and 8 families avoid eviction through emergency financial assistance and legal advocacy. More importantly, we had created a network of people who understood that their past mistakes didn't have to determine their future possibilities. The work was exactly what I had been training for without knowing it. Every skill I had learned during my darkest period, how to navigate bureaucratic systems, how to access resources that weren't widely advertised, how to build trust with people who had been let down by institutions, became tools for helping other people solve problems that seemed impossible. But the most valuable thing I brought to the work was authenticity. When I sat across from a 19-year-old who was considering drug dealing because his family was facing eviction, I could speak from experience about why that seemed like a rational choice and why it was actually the worst possible decision he could make. When I worked with a single mother who was overwhelmed by the complexity of college financial aid applications, I could share my own mother's story and show her that education really was a pathway to stability, not just a dream for people from different kinds of families. When I counseled someone who had been arrested for making the same kind of desperate choice I had made, I could offer hope based on personal experience rather than theoretical optimism. The foundation grew quickly because we were solving real problems for real people using methods that actually worked. Within 2 years, we had expanded to 3 locations, hired 12 full-time staff members, and partnered with local universities to provide scholarship opportunities for people with criminal records who were committed to building legitimate careers. But success brought unexpected challenges. The more visible our work became, the more I was invited to speak at conferences, write articles, and serve on boards where people wanted to hear about overcoming adversity and turning your life around. The problem was that these audiences were usually composed of people who had never faced the kinds of choices my clients and I had faced. They wanted inspiring stories about individual triumph that confirmed their belief that the system was basically fair and that people who struggled must somehow deserve their struggles. They didn't want to hear about systematic inequality, predatory lending, or the way that medical bankruptcy could destroy families who had done everything right. They didn't want to understand why intelligent people made desperate choices, or how easy it was for good kids from struggling families to end up in situations that looked like moral failures from the outside. I found myself in the uncomfortable position of being asked to inspire people by minimizing the systematic factors that had created the problems I was now helping others solve. That's when I realized I had to make another choice about who I wanted to be and what kind of impact I wanted to have. I could continue building a successful nonprofit that helped individuals solve their personal problems one at a time. It was meaningful work that made a real difference in the lives of people who needed support. But it didn't address the root causes of why those problems existed in the first place. Or I could use the platform and credibility I had built to advocate for systematic changes that would prevent other families from facing the kinds of impossible choices my mother and I had confronted. I chose to fight the system that had almost destroyed us. At 23, I was invited to testify before a state legislative committee that was considering reforms to the criminal justice system. Sitting at that witness table, looking out at elected officials who would determine policies affecting thousands of families like mine, I thought about that 18-year-old kid who had made a terrible decision because he couldn't see any legitimate alternatives. "Representatives," I began. 4 years ago, I was arrested for drug trafficking because my family was facing eviction, and I didn't know how to access the legitimate resources that could have prevented our crisis. I'm not here to make excuses for that choice or to minimize the serious consequences of drug-related crime. I paused, looking at faces that ranged from skeptical to genuinely interested. I'm here to talk about what happened after my arrest, and why the difference between punishment and rehabilitation matters not just for individuals like me, but for entire communities that are affected by how we respond to desperate choices made by young people who don't understand their options. I presented research showing that drug court programs had significantly lower recidivism rates than traditional prosecution. I shared statistics about the cost-effectiveness of treatment and education compared to incarceration. And I told stories about people I had worked with who had transformed their lives when given opportunities to learn legitimate skills instead of being permanently labeled as criminals. But most importantly, I talked about prevention, addressing the systematic issues that created the conditions where drug trafficking seemed like a rational choice for intelligent young people from struggling families. The night I made the worst decision of my life, I thought I had researched all my options, I explained. But I had never heard of emergency rental assistance programs, nonprofit credit counseling services, or educational grants for students from low-income families. These resources existed, but they weren't accessible to people who needed them most. I outlined policy recommendations for improving access to social services, strengthening the social safety net, and creating pathways for people with criminal records to rebuild their lives through education and legitimate employment. We can continue to spend taxpayer money prosecuting and incarcerating young people who make desperate choices, I concluded, or we can invest that same money in preventing the circumstances that make those choices seem necessary. One approach fills prisons and destroys families. The other approach builds communities and creates opportunities. The legislation that emerged from those hearings wasn't everything I had hoped for, but it included provisions for expanded drug court programs, increased funding for emergency financial assistance, and grants for organizations that provided job training for people with criminal records. Small changes, but changes that would affect real families facing real crises. 6 months later, I received a call from a program officer at the Ford Foundation who had heard about our work and wanted to discuss a significant grant opportunity. The foundation was looking to fund innovative approaches to breaking cycles of poverty and incarceration, particularly programs that addressed root causes rather than just treating symptoms. The 3-year, $2 million grant would allow us to expand our work to 10 cities, develop a comprehensive curriculum for teaching life skills and systems navigation, and create a policy advocacy component focused on systematic reform. But the most meaningful part of the proposal was a requirement that at least half of our staff be people who had personal experience with the criminal justice system. The foundation understood that credibility comes from lived experience, not just academic training. 2 years into the grant period, our model had been replicated in 12 states, and we were serving over 1,500 people annually. But the success I was most proud of had nothing to do with numbers or expansion. It was the call I received from a 20-year-old named James who had attended one of our workshops 6 months earlier. He had been facing eviction and considering drug dealing as a solution, but instead had used the resources we provided to access emergency rental assistance and enroll in a trade school program. "I just wanted you to know," he said, "that I started my first legitimate job today. Electrical apprentice, good pay, benefits, and a clear path to better opportunities. My little sister won't ever have to see her brother get arrested because he thought crime was his only option." That's when I understood what Michelle Washington had meant about revenge being success that proves the system wrong about what people like us are capable of achieving. But the victory that meant the most to me came on a quiet Sunday evening, 5 years after that night when my mother had told me we would have to sleep on the floor. I was sitting in my own living room, not fancy but clean and comfortable in mine, reviewing applications for our scholarship program. My mother was in the kitchen, preparing dinner and humming softly to herself, no longer worried about medical bills or rent payments or eviction notices. She walked into the living room carrying 2 cups of coffee, the same way she had done thousands of times when I was growing up. But this time, instead of sitting at a secondhand coffee table to discuss problems we couldn't solve, we were sitting on furniture we had chosen ourselves in a house we could afford to keep. "You know what I'm proudest of?" she asked, settling into her chair. "What?" "Not that you succeeded despite making that mistake, that you learned to use that mistake to help other people avoid making similar ones." She was right. The person I had become wasn't someone who had overcome his past. It was someone who had transformed his past into something useful for other people facing similar challenges. That hardwood floor had taught me something the system never wanted me to learn, that your circumstances don't define your destiny, that temporary setbacks don't have to become permanent defeats, and that the best way to change your own life is to help change other people's lives. 8 years after sleeping on that floor, I was invited to give the commencement address at my alma mater. Standing at the podium, looking out at hundreds of graduates who were about to enter a world full of opportunities and obstacles, I thought about what I wanted them to understand about success, failure, and the difference between surviving and thriving. Some of you will face circumstances that make you feel like you have to choose between your values and your family's survival, I began. Some of you will discover that doing everything right doesn't guarantee the outcomes you were promised. Some of you will learn that the systems you were taught to trust don't always work for people who look like you or come from places like you come from. I paused, remembering the fear and desperation that had once made crime seem like a rational choice. When that happens, you'll have a choice to make. You can see those circumstances as proof that the game is rigged and that you might as well play by different rules. Or you can see them as evidence that the game needs new players who understand how to change the rules. I looked out at faces that represented every kind of background and circumstance, knowing that some of them would face challenges I couldn't imagine, while others would encounter the same kinds of systematic barriers that had almost destroyed my family. The floor is not your ceiling, I concluded. Whatever floor you find yourself on, literal or metaphorical, remember that it's not where you stay. It's where you start building something better. The applause was generous, but the moment that mattered most came afterward, when a young woman approached me with tears in her eyes. "My family is facing eviction," she whispered. "I graduate next week, but I don't know if we'll have a place to live. I was thinking about other options." I handed her my business card and smiled. "Let me tell you about some legitimate options you might not know about. If you believe that your worst mistakes can become your greatest strengths, that temporary setbacks don't have to become permanent defeats, and that the best revenge against a system that expects you to fail is succeeding so thoroughly that you can help other people succeed too, then this story matters to you. Subscribe for more stories about young people who refuse to let their circumstances define their destinies. who learned to transform their struggles into strength, and who discovered that sometimes the most radical thing you can do is help other people avoid the mistakes you made. Because that floor taught me something the system never wanted me to learn. Your circumstances don't define your destiny. Where you start is not where you have to stay. And sometimes the best way to save yourself is to dedicate your life to saving other people from the choices that almost destroyed you. Hit that subscribe button if you believe that 48 hours can change everything, that rock bottom can become the foundation for something beautiful, and that the most powerful stories are the ones where people transform their pain into purpose. Because sometimes the floor isn't where you end up, it's where you learn to stand up and fight for something better.